Welcome back to the Biblical Mystery Channel. Today's news story is The Complete Story of Jephthah, the judge who won everything, then lost it all. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. What kind of man rises from rejection to become a national hero, only to be remembered for one of the most tragic and controversial stories in the entire Bible? The story of Jephthah begins in shame, rejected by his own family, driven from his home, and forced to survive as an outcast. He seemed destined to disappear into obscurity. Yet when Israel faced a powerful enemy, and no one else could save them, the nation turned to the very man they had cast aside. What followed was an extraordinary rise from exile to leadership, from forgotten outcast to judge of Israel. But Jephthah's story is not simply a tale of military victory. It is a story filled with political intrigue, ancient diplomacy, family tragedy, and one vow that has puzzled Bible readers, theologians, and historians for centuries. Did Jephthah truly sacrifice his daughter? Why would a man empowered by God make such a devastating decision? And how could someone whose life ended in such controversy later be remembered among the heroes of faith in the New Testament? To answer those questions, we must journey back to one of the darkest periods in Israel's history, a time when tribal divisions were tearing the nation apart. Spiritual confusion was everywhere, and the line between faithfulness and failure had become dangerously blurred. This is the complete story of Jephthah, long before Israel became a monarchy, before the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon reshaped the nation's political landscape. The Israelites lived as a loose confederation of tribes scattered throughout the land of Canaan. There was no capital city directing national affairs, no permanent royal administration, and no standing army capable of responding quickly to external threats. Authority was local, leadership was often temporary, and cooperation between tribes depended more on necessity than on strong political institutions. The world of the judges emerged during a period that many historians associate with the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, a time marked by regional instability across much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Powerful kingdoms that had once dominated the region weakened or disappeared. Trade networks were disrupted, populations shifted, and smaller societies were forced to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. Israel existed within that larger world, facing many of the same uncertainties that affected neighboring peoples. Yet the Book of Judges presents a deeper explanation for Israel's struggles. The central problem was not merely political weakness or military vulnerability. According to the biblical narrative, the nation's greatest crisis was spiritual. Again and again, the people drifted away from their covenant relationship with the Lord, adopted the religious practices of surrounding cultures, experienced oppression from foreign powers, cried out for deliverance, and were rescued through leaders raised up for specific moments of need. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the book. But what makes Judges remarkable is that the cycle never truly produces lasting transformation. Each generation seems to repeat the failures of the one before it. Temporary victories occur. Periods of peace return. But the underlying problems remain unresolved. As a result, the book becomes progressively darker. Early stories contain hope and renewal. Later stories reveal increasing fragmentation, violence, and confusion. The judges themselves reflect this decline. They are not kings, prophets, or priests in the traditional sense. They are emergency leaders who emerge during crises. Some demonstrate extraordinary faith. Others display serious weaknesses. Most embody both qualities at the same time: Unlike ancient royal inscriptions that celebrated rulers while hiding their failures, the biblical text often exposes the shortcomings of its most important figures. Gideon begins as a reluctant deliverer and ends his life associated with religious compromise. Samson possesses extraordinary strength, but repeatedly demonstrates poor judgment. As the narrative moves forward, the distance between Israel's calling and Israel's behavior becomes increasingly obvious. One of the most important observations made by the author appears near the conclusion of the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This statement functions as more than a political observation. It serves as a diagnosis of a society experiencing moral and social disintegration. The issue is not simply the absence of a monarch. The deeper concern is the absence of a shared commitment to covenant faithfulness. Tribal interests frequently outweigh national unity. Personal desires often take precedence over divine instruction. Communities that should cooperate instead compete with one another. The result is a nation that remains vulnerable not only to foreign enemies, but also to its own internal divisions. Archaeological research into the early Iron Age reveals a landscape dominated by small settlements, tribal identities, and regional competition, a setting that aligns remarkably well with the social conditions reflected in Judges. Israel occupied territory situated between major powers and important trade corridors, making the region strategically valuable, but also persistently unstable. The tribes faced pressure from multiple directions. To the west stood the growing influence of the Philistines. To the east and southeast were peoples such as the Ammonites and Moabites. Along the northern frontiers, Aramean influence continued to expand. Survival required more than military strength. It required unity, wise leadership, and a clear sense of identity. Yet, those were precisely the qualities becoming increasingly fragile. It is within this environment that the story of Jephthah begins. His life cannot be understood apart from the age that produced him. He emerges from a society struggling with questions of leadership, legitimacy, loyalty, and faithfulness. The challenges he faces are not isolated personal tragedies disconnected from larger events. They are deeply connected to the condition of Israel itself. The instability of the nation forms the backdrop for every major decision he will make. Before he becomes a commander, before he negotiates with kings, before he stands at the center of one of the Bible's most debated stories. The audience must first understand the world around him. It was a world where leadership often emerged from unexpected places, where tribal politics could alter the fate of entire regions, and where the future of a people frequently depended on imperfect individuals trying to navigate an increasingly uncertain age. In many ways, the story of Jephthah is not simply the story of one man. It is the story of Israel during one of the most turbulent chapters of its history. The story of Jephthah does not begin on a battlefield, in a council chamber, or during a national crisis. It begins within a family. In just a few verses, the Book of Judges introduces the personal circumstances that would shape the trajectory of his entire life. We are told that Jephthah was the son of a man named Gilead, and a woman described in most English translations as a prostitute. The statement is brief, yet for an ancient audience, it would have immediately communicated a complicated social reality. Family lineage was one of the most important foundations of life in ancient Israel. Identity, inheritance, economic security, social standing, and future opportunity were all closely connected to one's position within a household. Birth circumstances could influence how a person was perceived long before any individual choices were made. The text does not provide extensive information about Jephthah's mother, and scholars continue to debate certain nuances of the Hebrew terminology involved. Some interpret the description literally. Others suggest that the term may reflect a broader social category associated with marginal status or a non-traditional relationship. What remains beyond dispute is the narrative's central point. Jephthah occupied a vulnerable position within his father's family. As Gilead's other sons matured, tensions surrounding inheritance and legitimacy eventually surfaced. Inheritance was not simply about property. Land represented economic survival, family continuity, and long-term security. To possess a share in the family estate meant belonging to the future of the household. To lose that share meant exclusion from opportunities that shaped the rest of one's life. The conflict reached its climax when Jephthah's half-brothers drove him away and declared that he would have no inheritance among them because he was the son of another woman. Their decision reveals more than a private family dispute. It reflects the harsh realities of a society where questions of lineage and status could determine a person's place within the community. The action effectively severed Jephthah from the future his family had planned for itself. He was not merely denied property. He was denied participation in the legacy of his father's house. One of the remarkable features of the biblical account is how little emotional commentary it provides. The narrator does not describe Jephthah's reaction. There are no recorded speeches, tears, or confrontations. Yet the silence itself invites reflection. Human experience suggests that rejection by strangers can be painful, but rejection by one's own family often leaves deeper wounds. The people who were expected to provide protection and belonging became the source of exclusion. Such experiences frequently shape how individuals view authority, trust, loyalty, and identity for years afterward. While the text never explicitly analyzes Jephthah's psychology, it is difficult to imagine that this event left no lasting impact. Later episodes in his life reveal a man highly aware of questions surrounding recognition, honor, and legitimacy. Those concerns do not appear in a vacuum. They emerge from a personal history that began with exclusion from the place where he should have belonged most naturally. At the same time, the story introduces an important tension that will continue throughout the narrative. Although Jephthah occupies a disadvantaged social position, the text also identifies him as a mighty warrior. This description appears before his rise to national leadership and before any account of military achievement. The detail suggests that even at this early stage, he possessed qualities that others could not ignore: strength, courage, charisma, leadership ability, or some combination of these characteristics had already distinguished him from those around him. This contrast is significant because it highlights the gap between social status and personal capability. The family saw someone they considered unsuitable to inherit alongside them. The narrator sees someone whose abilities would eventually alter the course of regional history. Throughout Scripture, similar patterns appear again and again. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers before becoming a leader in Egypt. David is overlooked within his own family before becoming king. The biblical narrative repeatedly challenges assumptions about who is qualified to play a significant role in God's purposes. Yet Jephthah's story introduces an additional layer of complexity. Unlike some other figures whose rejection comes from outsiders, his exclusion emerges from a dispute rooted in legal and family concerns. The brothers are not portrayed as random villains acting without motive. They are protecting what they believe belongs to them. Their actions may be unjust, but they arise from recognizable human fears involving inheritance, competition, and status. This realism gives the account much of its power. The conflict feels less like a dramatic legend and more like a situation that could emerge within any family where resources, identity, and future security are at stake. There is also a larger historical dimension worth considering. During the era of the judges, tribal affiliation and family connections carried enormous importance. Political structures were relatively decentralized, which meant that households and clans often functioned as the primary units of social organization. Being pushed out of one's family network could therefore have consequences extending far beyond personal disappointment. It could affect economic survival, legal protection, and social belonging. Jephthah's departure marks the beginning of a life lived outside the normal structures that provided stability for most people in his world. Yet the irony at the heart of the story is already beginning to emerge. The very event intended to remove him from significance will ultimately place him on a path toward influence. Had he remained comfortably within his father's household, his life might have followed a predictable course. Instead, exclusion forces him into an uncertain future where different skills, different relationships, and different opportunities await. The family believes it has settled the question of Jephthah's place in the world. In reality, the story is only beginning. The young man leaving Gilead carries no inheritance, no secure position, and no clear destination. What he does carry are abilities that have not yet been fully tested, and a future that neither he nor his brothers can possibly foresee. After leaving Gilead, Jephthah disappears from the narrative for a time. But the silence should not be mistaken for inactivity. The next stage of his life unfolds in the land of Tob, a region located beyond the more settled territories associated with the Israelite tribes east of the Jordan. The precise location of Tob remains uncertain, though most scholars place it somewhere northeast of Gilead, in a frontier zone where political boundaries were less stable and centralized authority was limited. For people pushed to the margins of society, such regions often provided opportunities unavailable within established communities. Life on the frontier demanded adaptability. Survival depended less on family status and more on personal ability. In many parts of the ancient Near East, borderlands became places where displaced individuals, mercenaries, traders, refugees, and ambitious leaders could reinvent themselves outside the structures that had once defined them. Jephthah entered Tob as a man without inheritance or position. What he became there would eventually change the course of his life. The Book of Judges provides only a brief description of this period, stating that worthless men gathered around Jephthah and followed him. The phrase has often been misunderstood because modern readers naturally associate the word worthless with moral corruption. Yet the Hebrew expression is broader and more nuanced. In various Old Testament contexts, it can refer to individuals who lack social standing, economic security, or recognized status within conventional society. Some may have been opportunists, others may have been debtors, displaced laborers, adventurers, or men seeking protection in an unstable environment. The text does not provide detailed biographies because its focus lies elsewhere. The important point is that these men chose to follow Jephthah. Leadership is one of the few qualities that cannot be claimed in isolation. A person may declare himself a leader, but genuine leadership exists only when others willingly place their trust in his direction. The gathering of followers around Jephthah suggests that he possessed abilities capable of attracting loyalty in a difficult environment. This detail becomes even more significant when considered alongside the broader historical realities of the period. The regions east of the Jordan frequently experienced local conflicts, territorial disputes, and shifting alliances. Communities often relied on capable military figures to provide security against raids and rival groups. A successful leader could gain influence rapidly if he demonstrated courage, competence, and the ability to protect those under his authority. Although the biblical text does not describe individual campaigns or battles, it strongly implies that Jephthah developed a reputation during these years. By the time the elders of Gilead later seek him out, they already know who he is and what he is capable of doing. That reputation did not appear overnight. It was forged during the years spent beyond the boundaries of his former home. This period is also important because it explains why Jephthah eventually became such an effective leader. Many prominent figures in biblical history spend formative years in unexpected places before stepping into larger responsibilities. Moses spends decades in Midian before leading Israel out of Egypt. David learns leadership while living as a fugitive before becoming king. In a different way, Tob functions as a training ground for Jephthah. The frontier teaches lessons that settled life rarely provides. Decisions carry immediate consequences. Trust must be earned. Authority cannot rely solely on inherited status. Success depends on judgment, resilience, and the ability to inspire confidence under uncertain conditions. By the time Jephthah re-enters the main narrative, he is no longer simply a displaced member of a troubled family. He has become someone capable of commanding men and navigating dangerous situations. There is also an important psychological dimension to this chapter. Human beings are often shaped not only by what they gain, but also by what they lose. Jephthah's years in Tob likely reinforced qualities that would remain visible throughout the rest of his story. He learned to operate without depending on institutions that had once failed him. He learned to build influence rather than inherit it. He learned to establish his own place in the world rather than wait for others to grant it. These experiences may help explain why he later negotiates so carefully with the elders of Gilead, and why he demonstrates such confidence when dealing with political and military challenges. His leadership style reflects someone accustomed to earning authority through performance rather than receiving it automatically. Yet the story does not romanticize exile. Modern readers sometimes treat adversity as if hardship automatically produces wisdom or strength. The biblical narrative is more realistic. Difficult experiences can develop valuable qualities, but they can also leave lasting scars. The text never directly comments on how Jephthah viewed the years he spent away from home, but it does reveal that he never forgot the circumstances that brought him there. When representatives from Gilead eventually arrive seeking his help, the memory of what happened remains close to the surface. The past has not disappeared. It has simply become part of the man he has become. Another fascinating aspect of this chapter is how little Jephthah likely understood about his own future. From his perspective, life in Tob may have appeared permanent. There was no reason to assume that the people who forced him out would ever seek his return. There was no indication that he would one day become a judge of Israel. The narrative, therefore, creates a subtle contrast between human knowledge and historical reality. While Jephthah is building a life on the frontier, larger events are developing elsewhere. Political pressures are increasing. Regional tensions are growing. A crisis is approaching that will force the leaders of Gilead to reevaluate assumptions they once considered settled. The man they pushed beyond their borders has become exactly the kind of leader they no longer possess. Without realizing it, Jephthah's years in Tob are preparing him for responsibilities far greater than anything he could yet imagine. The frontier has given him followers, experience, and a reputation. Soon, those qualities will draw the attention of the very people who once believed they had removed him from their future. While Jephthah was establishing himself in Tob, events were unfolding in Gilead that would eventually force the region's leaders into a difficult position. The threat from the Ammonites had been growing for years. According to Judges 10, the eastern tribes of Israel endured prolonged pressure and oppression from this neighboring people, a situation that exposed both military weakness and political fragmentation. The conflict did not emerge suddenly. It developed within a broader context of instability that had become familiar during the era of the Judges. Israel's tribal structure often made coordinated responses difficult, particularly when threats affected one region more directly than another. Communities facing immediate danger could not always rely on rapid support from distant tribes, and leadership capable of uniting people across local interests was often in short supply. As the Ammonite challenge intensified, the limitations of this system became increasingly obvious. The biblical narrative places these military developments alongside a spiritual crisis. Once again, Israel had drifted into religious compromise, adopting the gods and practices of surrounding nations. The text describes a remarkable variety of foreign influences, suggesting that the problem extended beyond isolated acts of disobedience. The nation was losing its distinct identity. When the people eventually cried out for help, the response they received was not immediate deliverance, but a reminder of how frequently they had abandoned the covenant. Only after a period of repentance and renewed commitment does the story begin moving toward a solution. Yet even then, one major problem remained unresolved. The people lacked a leader capable of confronting the Ammonite threat. The elders of Gilead understood the seriousness of their situation. They needed more than courage. They needed someone with experience, authority, and the ability to inspire confidence during a crisis. At this point, the narrative introduces one of the most striking reversals in the entire Book of Judges. The solution to Gilead's problem was not found among the established leaders already living within the region. Instead, it existed beyond their borders in the form of a man they had once chosen to exclude. The years had changed many things, but they had not erased Jephthah's reputation. Stories of his abilities had apparently spread far enough that the elders knew exactly where to find him, and exactly why they needed him. This detail is important, because it reveals that Jephthah's influence had grown considerably since his departure. He was no longer a forgotten member of a disputed family. He had become a figure whose name carried weight in matters of leadership and warfare. The decision to seek him out was therefore both practical and symbolic. Practically speaking, he possessed skills that Gilead desperately needed. Symbolically, the journey forced the elders to confront the consequences of past decisions. The man standing between them and potential disaster was the same man who had once been denied a future among them. When the elders arrived in Tob, their request was straightforward. They wanted Jephthah to return and lead the fight against the Ammonites. Yet the conversation that follows immediately reveals that the past had not been forgotten. Jephthah did not respond with enthusiasm or gratitude. Instead, he confronted them with a question that exposed the uncomfortable reality beneath the meeting. Had they not hated him and driven him from his father's house? Why come to him now when they were in trouble? The power of this exchange lies in its realism. Years may have passed. Circumstances may have changed, but unresolved history still shaped the relationship between both sides. Jephthah's words demonstrate that success had not erased memory. The issue was not simply whether he would help. The issue was whether those seeking his help were willing to acknowledge the contradiction in their actions. They had once determined that he did not belong. Now, they were asking him to risk his life for the very community that had pushed him away. The elders' response is equally revealing. They do not attempt to argue about the past. They do not deny what happened. Instead, they focus entirely on the present crisis. Their need is so urgent that they are prepared to negotiate from a position of weakness. In many ancient societies, public honor carried enormous significance. People who occupied positions of authority rarely placed themselves in situations where they appeared dependent on someone they had previously rejected. Yet, that is exactly what is happening here. The balance of power has shifted. The elders possess official status, but Jephthah possesses something more valuable in that moment. He possesses the capability they lack. This reversal creates one of the central tensions of the chapter. Throughout much of his life, others determined Jephthah's place within society. Family decisions shaped his future. Community judgments influenced his opportunities. Now, for the first time, the situation is reversed. The future of Gilead depends in part on how he chooses to respond. The narrative does not present this as a moment of revenge. Jephthah does not immediately exploit the situation for personal satisfaction. Instead, the conversation becomes a negotiation about responsibility, authority, and the terms under which he is willing to return. The significance of that negotiation will shape everything that follows, before armies can be assembled, and before strategies can be discussed. A deeper question must be answered. If Jephthah returns to save Gilead, what place will he occupy among the people who once decided he had none? The answer to that question will transform a military request into a political turning point, and will mark the beginning of one of the most unexpected leadership transitions in the entire era of the judges. The meeting in Tob began as a request for military assistance, but it quickly evolved into something much larger. The elders of Gilead needed a commander capable of confronting the Ammonites. Yet, Jephthah understood that accepting such a role involved more than leading men into battle. Behind the immediate crisis stood a deeper question about authority, legitimacy, and the future political leadership of the region. The conversation recorded in Judges 11 reveals a level of strategic thinking that is often overshadowed by later events in the story. Rather than responding emotionally to the elders' appeal, Jephthah carefully evaluated what they were actually offering. Their initial proposal focused on the war itself. They wanted him to become their military leader during a time of emergency. From their perspective, the arrangement may have seemed straightforward. The region faced a threat. Jephthah possessed the necessary experience. The solution appeared obvious. Yet, history had taught him a lesson that many leaders learn only through painful experience. People often make promises during moments of desperation that they later reconsider once the crisis has passed. Military victories do not automatically translate into lasting influence, and temporary leaders can quickly become inconvenient once stability returns. The elders were asking Jephthah to assume enormous risks, but they had offered no clear answer regarding what would happen after the war. He therefore raised a question that changed the entire nature of the discussion. If he returned, defeated the Ammonites, and secured the safety of Gilead, would he become the head of all the inhabitants of the region? This was not a request for honor, gratitude, or financial reward. It was a negotiation concerning political authority. Jephthah recognized that leadership without clearly defined legitimacy would leave him vulnerable to the same forces that had already shaped much of his earlier life. He had no interest in becoming a disposable commander whose usefulness would end the moment victory was achieved. The request also reveals how much he had changed during his years away from Gilead. The young man who left home possessed little influence over his own circumstances. The leader, now speaking with the elders, understood leverage, timing, and the importance of formal commitments. He was negotiating from a position of strength because the realities of the situation favored him. The elders needed his abilities far more than he needed their approval. In many ways, this is one of the most significant turning points in the entire narrative. For the first time, Jephthah was not reacting to decisions made by others. He was helping determine the conditions under which future events would unfold. The elders agreed to his terms. Their response demonstrates just how serious the Ammonite threat had become. Faced with the possibility of military defeat and continued oppression, they were willing to elevate Jephthah to the highest level of leadership within Gilead. This agreement represented more than a personal victory. It was a public reversal of earlier judgments. The same society that had once excluded him from its future was now prepared to place its future in his hands. Yet, the narrative does not portray the moment as simple vindication. The focus remains on responsibility rather than revenge. Authority brings obligations as well as recognition, and Jephthah's acceptance of leadership would soon require decisions affecting entire communities, rather than merely his own circumstances. The location where the agreement was finalized adds another layer of significance. According to Judges, the parties traveled to Mizpah, where the terms were established before the Lord. In the ancient Israelite world, public agreements made in God's presence carried a seriousness that extended beyond ordinary political arrangements. Such commitments functioned as more than practical contracts between individuals. They involved moral and spiritual accountability. Both sides were placing themselves under a higher authority and publicly acknowledging obligations that could not be dismissed casually when circumstances changed. For the elders, this meant formally recognizing Jephthah's leadership if he fulfilled his role. For Jephthah, it meant accepting responsibility for the defense and future of the people he would lead. The scene provides one of the clearest windows into his character before the military campaign begins. Popular discussions often focus on the vow that appears later in the story, creating the impression that Jephthah was primarily impulsive or driven by emotion. This episode suggests something very different. He demonstrates patience, discipline, and political awareness. He does not allow past grievances to dictate his decisions, nor does he permit present opportunities to cloud his judgment. Instead, he insists on clarity before commitment. Such behavior reflects a leader who understands that effective governance depends not only on strength, but also on legitimacy. Historical studies of tribal societies frequently note that leadership during periods of crisis often emerged through negotiation rather than inheritance alone. Communities facing external threats were willing to elevate capable individuals if survival required it. The arrangement between Jephthah and the elders fits well within that broader context. His authority would rest not on royal lineage or institutional office, but on a combination of demonstrated ability, public recognition, and formal agreement. This helps explain why the narrative dedicates significant attention to the negotiation itself. The conversation is not a minor detail preceding the real story. It is part of the real story because it establishes the foundation upon which everything else will be built. By the time the agreement at Mizpah is complete, Jephthah occupies a dramatically different position from the one he held at the beginning of the narrative. He is no longer an outsider, living beyond the borders of Gilead. He is the recognized leader of a people preparing for war. Yet the challenge ahead extends beyond military strategy. Before any battle begins, one final effort will be made to prevent bloodshed altogether. The newly appointed leader will attempt something that many viewers may not expect from a man known primarily for warfare. He will try to win the conflict through words before resorting to weapons. Once Jephthah was formally recognized as leader in Gilead, many would have expected him to begin preparing immediately for war. The Ammonite threat had already destabilized the region for years. Tensions were escalating, and military confrontation seemed increasingly unavoidable. Yet the next move, recorded in Judges, reveals an unexpected dimension of his leadership. Before organizing a campaign, he initiated a diplomatic exchange with the king of Ammon. This decision is significant because it challenges the common image of Jephthah as merely a frontier warrior shaped by conflict. The narrative presents a man who understood that wars are often fought long before armies meet on the battlefield. Behind every military confrontation lies a struggle over legitimacy, memory, and competing interpretations of the past. Rather than beginning with force, Jephthah began with a question. Through messengers, he asked the king of Ammon why he had come against the land of Gilead. The response centered on territory. The Ammonite ruler claimed that Israel had seized land belonging to his people when the Israelites came out of Egypt centuries earlier. According to this argument, the current conflict was not an act of aggression, but an attempt to reclaim territory that had been unjustly taken. Such claims were common throughout the ancient world. Political leaders frequently appealed to history in order to justify present ambitions. A disputed border could become a dispute about memory, A military campaign could be presented as the correction of an ancient wrong. The king of Ammon was not merely making a military demand. He was presenting a historical case intended to legitimize his position. Jephthah responded with one of the longest speeches found anywhere in the Book of Judges. What makes the speech remarkable is not only its length but also its content. Instead of answering with threats or patriotic slogans, he constructs a detailed historical argument. His response draws heavily upon events recorded in the Pentateuch, particularly the wilderness traditions associated with the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. This is where the narrative reveals something many readers overlook. Jephthah appears to possess an unusually strong knowledge of Israel's national history, for a man who spent years outside the center of Israelite society. This is striking. The text never explains how he acquired such familiarity with these traditions, but the evidence is difficult to ignore. He demonstrates knowledge of Israel's route after the Exodus, the interactions with Edom and Moab, the conflict with Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the sequence of events that led to Israel's settlement east of the Jordan. Among the judges, few display this level of historical awareness. In fact, his speech contains one of the most sophisticated uses of historical reasoning in the entire book. Jephthah's argument rests on a crucial distinction. Israel did not take the disputed territory from Ammon. According to the biblical record, Israel avoided attacking Edom and Moab during the wilderness journey and sought peaceful passage through their lands. The territory in question was under the control of Sihon, king of the Amorites. Only after Sihon attacked Israel did a war occur, resulting in Israel's victory and occupation of Amorite territory. This distinction forms the foundation of Jephthah's case. If the land was acquired from the Amorites rather than the Ammonites, then the historical basis of Ammon's claim collapses. Modern historians may debate aspects of early Israelite settlement and the reconstruction of Iron Age territorial history, but within the logic of the biblical narrative, Jephthah's argument is internally consistent and carefully constructed. He is not merely repeating tradition. He is using tradition as evidence. The sophistication of his reasoning becomes even more apparent when he introduces a second argument. He notes that Israel had occupied the territory for roughly 3 centuries. If Ammon truly possessed a legitimate claim, why had no successful effort been made to recover it during all that time? This line of reasoning resembles principles found in many ancient legal systems, where long-term possession strengthened claims of ownership and legitimacy. Jephthah is therefore combining 2 different approaches. First, he disputes the original historical claim. Second, he argues that centuries of continuous occupation further weaken Ammon's position. The result is a remarkably comprehensive defense, built upon history, law, memory, and political reality. Another fascinating feature of the speech appears when Jephthah references Chemosh, the deity associated with neighboring peoples. He argues that nations generally possess what their gods have granted them, while Israel possesses what the Lord has given. Scholars have interpreted this statement in different ways. Some view it as diplomatic language intended to communicate within categories familiar to the Ammonite king. Others see it as reflecting the geopolitical worldview of the ancient Near East, where divine authority and territorial claims were often closely linked. Regardless of interpretation, Jephthah's larger point remains clear. Israel's possession of the land was not random or accidental. It was grounded in a historical narrative that the nation believed reflected divine guidance and legitimate inheritance. What makes this chapter especially important is that it reveals a side of Jephthah that many discussions overlook. Popular retellings often jump quickly from his rise to leadership toward the famous vow that follows. In doing so, they miss one of the most intellectually impressive moments in his entire story. The future judge demonstrates the ability to analyze competing claims, organize historical evidence, and present a coherent argument under pressure. The qualities displayed here are not those of a reckless adventurer. They are the qualities of someone capable of thinking carefully about politics, history, and national identity. In many respects, this speech serves as a reminder that leadership during the ancient world involved more than military skill. Leaders were expected to understand traditions, negotiate disputes, and defend the legitimacy of their people before they defended their borders. Yet, despite the strength of the argument, diplomacy failed. The king of Ammon ignored the message and rejected Jephthah's reasoning. The dispute would not be settled through negotiation. The possibility of a peaceful resolution had been offered and refused. With that rejection, the conflict moved beyond words. The historical case had been made. The diplomatic effort had ended. What remained was the reality both sides had been approaching from the beginning. The future of Gilead would now be decided, not in a debate over the past, but on the battlefield. With diplomacy exhausted and the Ammonite king unwilling to reconsider his position, the crisis reached its decisive stage. The arguments had been presented, the historical claims had been challenged, and every reasonable opportunity for a peaceful resolution had been explored. The future of Gilead would now depend on what happened in the coming conflict. It is at this exact moment that the narrative introduces one of its most significant theological statements. Judges records that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Within the Book of Judges, this language carries special importance. The Spirit's activity is repeatedly associated with God's intervention during moments of national crisis. Othniel receives divine empowerment before delivering Israel from oppression. Gideon is empowered to rally the tribes against Midian. Samson experiences extraordinary strength through the Spirit's work. In each case, the emphasis is not primarily on personal perfection, but on God's decision to use a particular individual for a particular purpose within Israel's history. The appearance of this phrase immediately before the military campaign signals that the coming victory, if it occurs, will ultimately be attributed to divine action, rather than human ability alone. Yet, what follows creates one of the most puzzling tensions in the entire story. Immediately after the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, Jephthah makes a vow. As he prepares for war, he declares that if the Lord grants him victory over the Ammonites, whatever comes out of the doors of his house to meet him, when he returns in peace, will belong to the Lord, and he will offer it up as a burnt offering. Few statements in the Old Testament have generated more discussion. The wording is brief, but its implications cast a shadow over everything that follows. What makes the moment especially striking is its placement within the narrative. The text has just informed readers that God has already empowered Jephthah for the task ahead. From a literary perspective, this raises an immediate question. Why does a vow appear after divine empowerment rather than before it? If the Spirit's presence signifies God's involvement in the coming deliverance, what purpose does the vow serve? The narrative does not provide a direct answer, and that silence has encouraged centuries of interpretation. Some scholars view the vow as an expression of sincere faith. In the ancient world, vows often functioned as acts of dedication, gratitude, or commitment. Individuals sometimes made promises to God during moments of uncertainty as a way of expressing dependence upon divine help. Others argue that the vow reveals something less admirable. Throughout the period of the Judges, Israel was surrounded by cultures in which vows, sacrificial bargains, and dramatic religious pledges frequently accompanied military campaigns. It is possible that Jephthah's understanding of devotion had been shaped, at least in part, by the assumptions of the world around him. Rather than trusting entirely in the empowerment already granted by God, he may have felt compelled to add something of his own. A third possibility focuses on the psychological pressures surrounding the moment. Jephthah stood at the center of a crisis affecting an entire region. He carried responsibility for the safety of thousands of people. Military leadership in the ancient world involved uncertainty on a scale difficult for modern audiences to appreciate. Even experienced commanders could not predict the outcome of battle with confidence. In that environment, the vow may reflect not theological confusion alone, but also the immense weight of expectation resting upon his shoulders. Whatever his motives, the text deliberately leaves them unexplained. Instead of analyzing his thoughts, the narrative allows readers to observe his actions and consider their implications. This restraint is characteristic of biblical storytelling. The narrator rarely pauses to provide psychological commentary. Meaning emerges through events rather than explicit explanations. Another important observation concerns the nature of vows within Israel's legal and religious tradition. The Old Testament takes vows seriously. Promises made before God were not considered casual statements. They carried moral and spiritual weight. At the same time, the Torah contains detailed instructions governing vows, dedications, and offerings. This background matters because it reminds readers that devotion in ancient Israel was not intended to operate without boundaries. Faithfulness involved obedience as well as sincerity. Zeal alone did not determine whether an action was wise. These themes become increasingly important as the story unfolds. For now, however, the narrative does not invite readers to evaluate the vow's eventual consequences. Instead, it introduces the vow as a source of tension. Up to this point, Jephthah's rise has been marked by careful decisions. He negotiated effectively with the elders of Gilead. He approached the Ammonite dispute through diplomacy before considering war. He demonstrated historical knowledge, political judgment, and strategic thinking. The vow stands apart from those earlier actions. It enters the story suddenly, creating uncertainty where confidence previously existed. This contrast may be intentional. Human beings often display different qualities under different pressures. Wisdom in one area does not guarantee wisdom in every area. Competence in leadership does not eliminate the possibility of serious mistakes. The narrative appears increasingly interested in exploring this reality. One of the reasons the story remains so powerful is that readers know something the characters do not. Jephthah sees the vow as part of his preparation for battle. The audience sees it as a narrative thread whose significance has not yet been revealed. The statement lingers over the chapter without immediate resolution. No one knows what will emerge from the house. No one knows how the vow will intersect with future events. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the drama. The military conflict remains the visible challenge. But another challenge has quietly entered the story. The words spoken before the battle now exist alongside the battle itself, waiting for a moment when their consequences will become impossible to ignore. As Jephthah moves toward the confrontation with Ammon, he does so empowered by the Spirit of the Lord, entrusted with the leadership of his people, and carrying a vow whose full meaning neither he nor the audience has yet begun to understand. After the failed diplomatic exchange with the king of Ammon, the conflict finally moved from words to war. Unlike many ancient military accounts that devote extensive attention to strategy and battlefield detail, the Book of Judges describes the campaign with remarkable brevity. The narrative's primary concern is not military technique, but the outcome itself. Having already stated that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, the text now presents the result of that divine empowerment. The Ammonites were defeated. Judges records that Jephthah struck them across a broad region, stretching from Aroer through numerous settlements as far as Abel-Keramim. The description suggests a decisive victory rather than a narrow escape. The people who had oppressed Israel's eastern territories for years suffered a crushing setback, and the immediate threat to Gilead was removed. For the communities living east of the Jordan, The victory represented far more than a successful military operation. It marked the end of a long period of insecurity and fear. Families who had lived under the pressure of conflict could once again look toward a more stable future. Fields could be cultivated without the constant threat of invasion. Trade routes could function more normally. Local leaders could begin thinking beyond mere survival. In many respects, this was exactly the outcome the elders of Gilead had hoped for when they traveled to Tob seeking help. The leader they selected had accomplished the task that seemed impossible only a short time earlier. From a public perspective, Jephthah stood at the height of success. He had secured the position he negotiated at Mizpah. He had defeated a dangerous enemy. He had validated the confidence placed in him by the people he now led. In most heroic narratives, this is the point where celebration begins and the story moves toward resolution. Yet, the Book of Judges rarely follows conventional expectations. One of its most distinctive literary features is its ability to place triumph and tragedy side by side, often allowing one to emerge at the precise moment the other appears complete. The transition happens almost immediately. The battlefield disappears from view. Military strategy, troop movements, and territorial gains cease to matter. The narrative shifts from national events to a single household. Jephthah returns home as a victorious leader. The war is over. The threat has been removed. The future appears secure. Then, one of the most memorable scenes in the entire book unfolds. As he approaches his house, the first person to come out and meet him is his daughter. She emerges with tambourines and dancing, participating in a form of celebration that would have been familiar throughout the ancient Near East. Victorious warriors were often welcomed home with music, singing, and public rejoicing. Similar scenes appear elsewhere in Scripture. After Israel crossed the Red Sea, Miriam led the women in celebration. Following David's military victories, women came out from the cities with songs and instruments. Jephthah's daughter is therefore acting in a way that would have seemed entirely natural within her cultural context. She is not responding to a tragedy. She is celebrating a triumph. What makes the scene so powerful is that the audience immediately understands something she does not. Since the vow was introduced in the previous chapter, readers recognize the significance of her appearance before a single word is spoken. The narrative allows two realities to collide in the same moment. For the daughter, this is a scene of joy. For Jephthah, it becomes a scene of horror. The contrast could hardly be sharper. The person emerging from the house is not a servant, a relative, or an animal. It is his only child. Judges emphasizes this fact with unusual clarity. She was his one and only daughter. Apart from her, he had neither son nor daughter. The statement serves a narrative purpose far beyond simple description. It highlights everything that is at stake. In the ancient world, children represented more than emotional attachments. They embodied the future of a household. Through them, family identity continued across generations. Through them, inheritance passed forward. Through them, names and legacies endured. The arrival of Jephthah's daughter, therefore, introduces implications extending far beyond the immediate moment. His reaction is equally dramatic. He tears his clothes, a traditional expression of grief and distress found throughout the Old Testament. Unlike many modern displays of emotion, tearing one's garments served as a visible public sign that a person had experienced profound sorrow or shock. Jephthah cries out that his daughter has brought him low and become the source of his trouble because he has opened his mouth to the Lord and cannot take back what he has spoken. These words reveal the sudden realization that the vow he made before battle is no longer an abstract possibility. Until now, it existed only as a future condition attached to victory. Now, victory has arrived. and the vow stands directly before him in human form. The scene is deliberately uncomfortable because it refuses to separate success from consequence. Modern storytelling often rewards heroes with uncomplicated triumph after overcoming adversity. Judges offers something more complex. The same event that secures deliverance for the nation creates anguish within the household of the deliverer. Public victory and private sorrow arrive together. The narrative does not yet explain what will happen next. It does not pause to analyze legal options, theological implications, or interpretive debates. Those questions belong to later chapters. For the moment, the focus remains on the emotional weight of the encounter itself. The military campaign that dominated the narrative has ended, but another conflict has begun. This new conflict cannot be resolved through military skill, political negotiation, or strategic planning. No army can defeat it. No diplomatic argument can remove it. It exists because of words spoken before the battle ever started. The war against Ammon has been won. What remains is a far more personal struggle, one that will force both Jephthah and the audience to confront some of the most difficult questions in the entire Book of Judges. As the shock of Jephthah's return home settles over the narrative, the focus shifts away from the judge himself and toward a figure who occupies surprisingly little space in the text, yet carries enormous emotional and theological significance. One of the most striking details in the entire account is that Jephthah's daughter is never named. In a book filled with warriors, tribal leaders, kings, and military conflicts, one of its most memorable characters remains anonymous. The omission has fascinated readers for centuries because names hold great importance throughout the biblical world. Names preserve identity, family history, memory, and legacy. Yet the young woman standing at the center of this tragedy is identified only through her relationship to her father. The text offers no personal name, no genealogy beyond her immediate connection to Jephthah, and no additional details about her life before the events unfolding in Judges 11. Scholars have proposed various explanations for this absence. Some view it as a literary technique intended to emphasize the universal dimensions of the tragedy rather than the biography of a single individual. Others suggest that the narrative's focus on Jephthah naturally limits the information provided about secondary characters. Whatever the reason, the effect is powerful. Readers remember her not because of a name, but because of the role she plays in one of the Bible's most difficult stories. After hearing her father's explanation, the daughter responds in a manner that has often surprised interpreters. Modern audiences frequently expect resistance, anger, or attempts to escape the situation. Instead, the text presents a response marked by composure and seriousness. She acknowledges the vow and asks for one request before anything further happens. She wishes to spend 2 months in the mountains with her companions to mourn her virginity. This detail is crucial because it becomes one of the central features of the entire narrative. The text does not say that she mourned her death. It repeatedly states that she mourned her virginity. The distinction is important, and later becomes a major factor in debates concerning the meaning of the vow itself. Before examining those debates, however, it is necessary to understand why virginity occupies such a prominent place in the story. In the modern world, individual identity is often understood primarily through personal achievements, career choices, or self-expression. The social realities of the ancient Near East were very different. Marriage, family continuity, and descendants carried immense significance. Children ensured the continuation of a household, preserved inheritance rights, and maintained a family's place within the broader community. For an only child, these concerns became even more important. Jephthah's daughter represented the future of his family line. Through her, future generations might continue the household he had fought so hard to establish. Through her, inheritance and memory could pass forward. The loss of that future would have been devastating from both a personal and social perspective. The 2 months spent in the mountains therefore function as more than a simple period of mourning. They create a pause within the narrative, allowing readers to contemplate the human cost of the situation before the story moves toward its conclusion. The biblical text provides few details about what occurred during this time, but the restraint may be intentional. Ancient Hebrew storytelling often achieves emotional impact through simplicity rather than elaborate description. The audience is given enough information to understand the significance of the moment without being guided through every emotional reaction. The silence creates space for reflection. A young woman who had greeted her father's return with celebration now withdraws into the hills to contemplate a future dramatically different from the one she once expected. Another noteworthy aspect of the passage is the contrast between father and daughter. Up to this point, Jephthah has dominated the narrative. He negotiates with elders, debates kings, commands armies, and makes decisions affecting entire regions. His daughter enters the story only briefly, yet her response becomes one of its defining moments. She possesses none of the authority held by the men around her. She has no influence over military strategy, political agreements, or the vow itself. Yet, within the limited space given to her, she demonstrates remarkable dignity. The text does not portray her as passive or indifferent. Rather, she confronts the reality before her with a seriousness that many readers have found deeply moving. Throughout Jewish and Christian history, some interpreters have viewed her as one of the quiet moral centers of the story. The narrative never explicitly praises her, but neither does it ignore the courage reflected in her response. There is also a literary irony present throughout the chapter. Earlier in life, Jephthah was denied participation in his father's inheritance because of disputes concerning family status and legitimacy. Now, after achieving leadership, military success, and public recognition, he faces the possibility that his own household may have no future beyond the present generation. The issue is no longer whether he will inherit. The issue is whether anyone will inherit after him. The tension is subtle, but significant, because it connects the beginning of his story with its most painful developments. Questions of family continuity, belonging, and legacy have followed him from the opening chapters onward. At the same time, the narrative carefully avoids resolving the central question that increasingly occupies the reader's attention. What exactly will happen when the 2 months end? The story continues to move forward, but the answer remains just beyond reach. Instead of immediately providing a conclusion, the text draws attention to themes of family, memory, and the future. The daughter remains unnamed, yet her presence dominates the narrative. Her request is granted. The time passes, and as the end of the 2 months approaches, the story arrives at a point where interpretation, theology, and history will converge around one of the most debated passages in the entire book of Judges. At the end of the 2 months, the narrative arrives at one of the most debated moments in the entire Old Testament. For generations, readers have asked the same question: what exactly happened to Jephthah's daughter? The reason the debate continues is not because the passage has been ignored or insufficiently studied. Quite the opposite. It has been examined in extraordinary detail by biblical scholars, theologians, historians, linguists, and religious commentators for centuries. The challenge is that the text itself is remarkably brief. After describing the daughter's return from the mountains, Judges states that Jephthah fulfilled the vow he had made. Immediately afterward, the narrative adds that she had never known a man. Then, the story moves on. The brevity of the account creates a situation familiar to students of ancient texts. The most important interpretive questions emerge precisely because the author chooses not to provide extensive explanation. As a result, Two major interpretations have dominated scholarly discussion. The first, and historically most widespread interpretation, argues that Jephthah literally sacrificed his daughter. According to this reading, the language of the vow should be understood in its most straightforward sense. Jephthah promised that whatever came out of his house would be offered as a burnt offering if victory were granted. Throughout the Old Testament, the phrase translated as burnt offering normally refers to a sacrificial act involving death. Supporters of this interpretation, therefore, argue that the simplest reading of the text points toward an actual human sacrifice. Several additional observations strengthen this position. Jephthah's reaction when he first sees his daughter is one of overwhelming devastation. The emotional intensity appears difficult to explain if the outcome involved only a life of celibacy. The overall tone of the narrative is deeply tragic, and many scholars believe that tragedy reaches its natural climax if the daughter ultimately dies. Furthermore, the Book of Judges repeatedly portrays a society experiencing increasing moral and spiritual decline. Within that broader context, the idea that an Israelite leader could commit a terrible act is entirely consistent with the book's larger themes. Those who hold this view often argue that the story is meant to shock readers by demonstrating how far Israel had drifted from the standards established in God's law. Yet, a second interpretation has gained substantial support among many modern scholars and interpreters. According to this view, Jephthah's daughter was not sacrificed, but dedicated to a life of permanent service to God, which included lifelong virginity and the absence of marriage or children. The strongest argument for this position comes directly from the narrative itself. Throughout the account, the emphasis consistently falls upon virginity rather than death. The daughter mourns her virginity in the mountains. The text repeats this concern multiple times. Even after the vow is fulfilled, the narrative highlights that she never knew a man. Supporters of this interpretation argue that if physical death were the primary issue, the repeated focus on virginity would be unexpected. Instead, the text appears deeply concerned with the loss of marriage, descendants, and family continuity. This reading also draws support from Israel's legal traditions. The Torah repeatedly condemns human sacrifice and identifies it as a practice associated with surrounding pagan cultures. Given these prohibitions, many interpreters find it difficult to believe that the narrative would describe an actual human sacrifice without offering stronger condemnation or commentary. Some, therefore, propose that Jephthah's vow should be understood as involving dedication to God rather than literal sacrifice in cases where a human being was involved. Under this interpretation, the daughter's future was still profoundly altered, but she remained alive, devoted to a unique life of service that prevented marriage and the continuation of Jephthah's family line. Both interpretations possess strengths. Both face challenges. Those who favor the sacrifice view must explain why the narrative repeatedly directs attention toward virginity, rather than describing death more explicitly. Those who favor the dedication view must explain why the language of the vow appears so closely connected to sacrificial terminology elsewhere in Scripture. As a result, many contemporary scholars acknowledge that complete certainty may be impossible. The text simply does not provide enough information to eliminate every question. This is one reason why the debate has remained active across Jewish, Christian, and academic traditions for so long. What is especially important to recognize is that the narrative itself appears less interested in satisfying later curiosity than in emphasizing the consequences of the vow. Whether one adopts the sacrifice interpretation or the dedication interpretation, the practical result remains strikingly similar in one crucial respect. Jephthah's household has no future beyond the present generation. The daughter, who represented the continuation of his family line, will leave no descendants. The household that he fought so hard to secure effectively reaches its endpoint. This observation connects the climax of the story to themes that have been present from the beginning: questions of inheritance, family identity, and continuity have followed Jephthah throughout his life. Early in the narrative, he was denied participation in his father's inheritance. Now, at the height of his success, he faces the reality that there may be no future generation to inherit after him. The irony is profound and difficult to miss. The struggle that began within a family ultimately circles back to the future of a family. At the same time, one final observation deserves attention before moving forward. The text never records God commanding the vow. It never states that God requested it. It never presents the vow as a condition for victory. These facts become increasingly important as interpreters evaluate the larger meaning of the story. The question of what happened to Jephthah's daughter remains one of the Bible's most difficult interpretive challenges, and sincere readers continue to reach different conclusions. Yet, beneath the debate lies a reality on which nearly everyone agrees. A decision made before the battle produced consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. The military victory that secured Israel's future came intertwined with a personal tragedy that would define Jephthah's legacy for generations to come. After examining the debate surrounding Jephthah's daughter, a larger question emerges. What is the biblical author actually trying to teach through this story? For many readers, the instinctive assumption is that if an event appears in Scripture, it must therefore be endorsed by Scripture. Yet, one of the most important principles for understanding biblical narrative is recognizing the difference between description and approval. The Bible frequently records actions without presenting those actions as examples to follow. Kings commit acts of injustice. Prophets make mistakes. Disciples fail dramatically. Entire nations abandon God's commands. The presence of an event in the biblical record does not automatically mean the event carries divine endorsement. This distinction is especially important when approaching the story of Jephthah. Regardless of how one interprets the precise outcome of the vow, the narrative itself offers several clues that caution readers against treating the episode as a model of faithful devotion. The first clue appears before the vow is ever spoken. Judges tells us that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah prior to the battle against Ammon. In literary terms, this detail establishes the source of the coming victory. Divine empowerment has already been granted. The narrative never suggests that God required an additional promise before acting on behalf of Israel. The vow originates entirely with Jephthah. It is his initiative rather than God's command. This observation may seem small, but it has significant implications. Throughout Scripture, moments of genuine faith are often characterized by trust in what God has already promised. By contrast, Jephthah appears to introduce an additional condition into a situation where divine assistance has already been declared. The text does not pause to condemn him directly, but neither does it praise the decision. Instead, it allows the consequences to speak for themselves. This narrative technique appears frequently in the Old Testament. Rather than interrupting the story with explicit moral commentary, the author often reveals the wisdom or foolishness of an action through the results that follow. Another important factor involves the broader trajectory of the Book of Judges itself. Modern readers sometimes approach the Judges as if they were a sequence of increasingly heroic leaders. In reality, the opposite pattern often emerges. As the book progresses, Israel's social and spiritual condition deteriorates. The stories become darker, conflicts become more destructive, and leaders display increasingly complicated flaws. The author appears intentionally portraying a nation struggling to remain faithful amid growing confusion. Jephthah belongs to this larger narrative movement. His strengths are real. His leadership abilities are undeniable. Yet the story simultaneously exposes weaknesses that reflect the troubled age in which he lived. Understanding this context helps explain why the narrative feels so uncomfortable. It is supposed to feel uncomfortable. The tension is part of the message. The story invites readers to recognize that deliverance and imperfection can coexist within the same individual. This broader perspective also helps explain why the narrative never celebrates the vow itself. Consider what the story chooses to emphasize. It highlights sorrow rather than triumph. It focuses on loss rather than reward. It presents a family facing irreversible consequences rather than a leader receiving divine praise. If the author's intention were to encourage similar vows, the structure of the narrative would be surprisingly ineffective. Instead, the story reads more like a warning than a recommendation. Throughout biblical wisdom literature, rash words are repeatedly portrayed as dangerous. Ecclesiastes cautions against making vows hastily. Proverbs warns about speaking without sufficient reflection. The Psalms repeatedly associate wisdom with disciplined speech. Jephthah's story fits naturally within that broader biblical concern. Words carry consequences, especially when spoken in moments of pressure, fear, or uncertainty. There is another theological lesson embedded within the narrative. Human beings often assume that greater sacrifice automatically reflects greater devotion. Yet, one of the consistent themes running throughout Scripture is that God values faithful obedience above dramatic displays of religious intensity. The prophets repeatedly challenge rituals that lack understanding. Samuel famously tells Saul that obedience is better than sacrifice. Centuries later, Jesus criticizes outward acts of piety that fail to reflect the heart of God's intentions, again and again. The biblical message pushes back against the idea that extraordinary religious gestures can compensate for a misunderstanding of what God actually desires. This theme becomes especially relevant in the story of Jephthah, because the tragedy appears to emerge not from a lack of sincerity, but from a misplaced understanding of devotion. Nothing in the narrative suggests that Jephthah was attempting to rebel against God. The problem is more subtle. Sincerity by itself does not guarantee wisdom. Good intentions do not automatically produce good outcomes. One can be earnest, devoted, and completely convinced of one's actions while still making a serious mistake. The Bible's honesty about this reality is one of its most remarkable features. It refuses to reduce faith to simple formulas. Faithful people can make poor decisions. Courageous leaders can exercise flawed judgment. Great victories can be accompanied by painful consequences. The story therefore functions on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a personal tragedy. It is a reflection of Israel's spiritual condition. It is a cautionary tale about vows. It is also a reminder that leadership and wisdom are not identical concepts. Jephthah possessed qualities that made him an effective commander and negotiator. Those strengths, however, did not exempt him from the possibility of error. In many ways, that is precisely what makes the narrative so enduring. Readers recognize something profoundly human within it. The same person can display wisdom in one moment and poor judgment in another. The same individual can achieve remarkable success while simultaneously creating unnecessary sorrow. By the end of the account, the central lesson is becoming increasingly clear. The Bible does not preserve this story because it wants readers to imitate every action Jephthah took. It preserves the story because it reveals the complexity of faith, leadership, and human decision-making within a broken world. The tragedy remains painful, precisely because it was never meant to be celebrated. It stands as a sobering reminder that devotion without discernment can lead to consequences no victory is able to erase. If the story of Jephthah ended with the events surrounding his daughter, it would already rank among the most emotionally complex narratives in the Book of Judges. Yet the biblical account continues, and what follows reveals another dimension of the crisis facing Israel during this period. The threat no longer comes from Ammon. The battlefield shifts inward. The next conflict emerges between Israelites themselves. This transition is deeply significant because it exposes a recurring problem that runs throughout the latter portions of Judges. External enemies were dangerous, but internal division often proved just as destructive. The tribes that shared a common ancestry, a common covenant, and a common history frequently struggled to act as a unified people. In many ways, the confrontation that follows tells us as much about the condition of Israel as it does about Jephthah himself. The dispute begins when members of the tribe of Ephraim challenge the leader of Gilead. Their complaint centers on the recent war against the Ammonites. According to the Ephraimites, they had not been properly included in the campaign, and their frustration quickly escalated into open hostility. The language recorded in Judges is strikingly aggressive. They threaten to burn Jephthah's house over him, turning a political grievance into a personal confrontation. To modern readers, the reaction may seem disproportionate, but similar tensions had surfaced earlier in the Book of Judges. During the time of Gideon, Ephraim also expressed resentment after not being given a more prominent role in military operations. In tribal societies where honor, reputation, and influence carried immense importance, exclusion from a major victory could be interpreted as a challenge to status. The issue was not merely military participation, it was recognition. It was prestige. It was a dispute over who mattered and who did not. Jephthah's response reveals that the two sides remembered recent events very differently. He argues that assistance had been requested during the conflict with Ammon, and that Ephraim failed to provide help when it was needed. Whether the disagreement reflects genuine misunderstanding, competing memories, or political maneuvering is impossible to determine with certainty. The text does not provide enough information to reconstruct every detail. What is clear is that neither side was willing to yield. The dispute quickly moved beyond words and developed into armed conflict. This escalation is one of the most troubling aspects of the entire episode. Not long earlier, Israel had been fighting for survival against a foreign enemy. Now, members of the covenant community were taking up arms against one another. The victory over Ammon had removed an external threat, but it had not resolved the deeper fractures within the nation itself. The resulting battle ended in favor of Gilead. Jephthah's forces defeated the Ephraimites and gained control of the fords of the Jordan River, strategic crossing points that became critical during the aftermath of the conflict. Throughout ancient military history, rivers often served as natural barriers capable of shaping the outcome of campaigns. Armies retreating across a river could find themselves trapped if key crossings were controlled by an opposing force. That is precisely what happened here. As surviving Ephraimites attempted to escape, the men of Gilead implemented an identification test that would become one of the most famous linguistic episodes in history. Each individual seeking to cross the river was asked to pronounce a single word. The word was shibboleth. At first glance, the test appears almost absurd in its simplicity. Yet language has always carried markers of regional identity. Accents, pronunciations, and speech patterns often reveal where a person comes from, even when other clues are absent. According to the biblical account, the Ephraimites struggled to pronounce the word correctly, and instead said Sibboleth. This subtle difference immediately exposed their identity. Those identified as Ephraimites were seized and killed. The story reports a death toll of 42,000. Scholars debate how ancient numbers should be interpreted and whether such figures reflect precise counts, rounded estimates, or literary conventions. Regardless of the exact number, the narrative's point is unmistakable. The scale of the tragedy was enormous. Thousands of Israelites died not at the hands of foreign invaders, but in a conflict between fellow Israelites. The episode has attracted attention far beyond biblical studies because of the word shibboleth itself. Over time, the term entered broader language and acquired a meaning extending well beyond its original context. Today, a shibboleth often refers to any characteristic, custom, phrase, or belief that distinguishes one group from another. Linguists, historians, and political scientists frequently use the concept when discussing markers of social identity. Yet modern usage can sometimes obscure the grim reality behind the story. The original shibboleth was not an interesting linguistic curiosity. It was a matter of life and death. A minor variation in pronunciation determined who lived and who died at the Jordan River. The incident, therefore, provides a remarkable illustration of how deeply divided the tribes had become. What should have been small regional differences had become boundaries reinforced through violence. More importantly, the episode reveals the larger trajectory of the Book of Judges. Earlier chapters often focus on conflicts between Israel and surrounding nations. As the book progresses, internal conflicts become increasingly prominent. The danger is no longer only outside the borders. It exists within the community itself. Jephthah's story captures this shift with unusual clarity. He successfully confronts a foreign threat, yet he cannot prevent bloodshed among his own people. The contrast is sobering. Military victories can defeat external enemies, but they cannot automatically heal divisions rooted in pride, rivalry, and fractured relationships. In many respects, the conflict with Ephraim serves as a mirror reflecting the broader condition of Israel. The nation remained capable of producing courageous leaders and winning important battles, but unity was becoming increasingly fragile. Tribal loyalties often overshadowed collective identity. Personal grievances escalated into public crises. The result was a society struggling not only against its enemies, but also against itself. By the time the fighting ends, the reader is left with a troubling realization. The Ammonites had threatened Israel's security. The conflict at the Jordan revealed something even more dangerous. A people divided against itself could suffer wounds that no battlefield victory was capable of repairing. After reading the story of Jephthah in the Book of Judges, many people are surprised to discover that his name appears centuries later in one of the most celebrated passages of the New Testament. The surprise is understandable. By the time his narrative concludes, readers have encountered military victories, political negotiations, family tragedy, tribal conflict, and some of the most difficult interpretive questions in the entire Old Testament. Jephthah is not the kind of figure most people expect to find listed among the great examples of faith. Yet in Hebrews 11, often called the Hall of Faith, his name appears alongside Gideon, Barak, Samson, David, Samuel, and the prophets. For modern readers, this raises an important question. What exactly did the author of Hebrews see in Jephthah that warranted inclusion in such a chapter? The answer begins with understanding the purpose of Hebrews 11 itself. Contrary to popular assumption, the chapter is not a collection of flawless heroes. It is a survey of individuals who trusted God in decisive moments of history. The distinction is crucial. Hebrews does not attempt to provide complete biographies. It does not catalog every success or every failure. Instead, it highlights specific acts of faith that demonstrated confidence in God's promises despite uncertainty, opposition, or danger. This explains why many figures included in the chapter possessed deeply complicated personal histories. Abraham displayed remarkable faith. yet also experienced moments of fear and poor judgment. Jacob became a central figure in Israel's story, despite a life marked by deception and family conflict. Samson appears in the list even though much of his narrative involves reckless choices and personal weakness. The author's purpose is not to declare these individuals morally perfect. The purpose is to identify moments where genuine faith became visible through action. Within that framework, Jephthah's inclusion becomes easier to understand. When the elders of Gilead approached him, the situation facing Israel was serious. The Ammonites had exerted pressure on the region for years. Political leadership was fragmented. The future was uncertain. Jephthah accepted responsibility for leading a vulnerable population into a conflict whose outcome could not be guaranteed. From the perspective of Hebrews, this act required faith. He stepped into a role carrying enormous risk and trusted that God would provide deliverance. The military victory that followed became part of the larger pattern of divine intervention, celebrated throughout the chapter. Hebrews therefore focuses on the reality of faith present within Jephthah's story, rather than attempting to evaluate every aspect of his life. This observation highlights an important feature of New Testament theology. The biblical concept of faith is not reserved exclusively for individuals with perfect records. Throughout Scripture, faith often appears within people who remain deeply flawed. The emphasis falls on trust in God rather than on flawless human performance. This does not minimize moral responsibility, nor does it excuse poor decisions. Instead, it reflects the Bible's broader realism about human nature. The men and women through whom God works are frequently imperfect, complicated, and sometimes inconsistent. Jephthah fits comfortably within that pattern. His story contains wisdom and tragedy, courage and controversy, leadership and sorrow. Yet Hebrews identifies a genuine act of trust within that complexity and chooses to highlight it. Another factor worth considering is the historical situation faced by the original audience of Hebrews. The letter was written to encourage believers experiencing hardship and uncertainty. Throughout the book, the author repeatedly points readers toward earlier generations who remained faithful despite difficult circumstances. In that context, Jephthah's background becomes particularly significant. He did not emerge from a position of privilege or security. His path to leadership was unlikely from the beginning. Much of his life unfolded under conditions that would have caused many people to abandon hope altogether. Yet he eventually became a central figure in one of Israel's major deliverance narratives for readers facing adversity. Such examples served an important purpose. They demonstrated that God's purposes were not limited to individuals with ideal circumstances, prestigious backgrounds, or straightforward life stories. Hebrews also encourages readers to view biblical history through a wider lens than immediate success or failure. Human beings often evaluate lives by identifying defining moments and allowing those moments to dominate everything else. In Jephthah's case, many discussions focus almost exclusively on the vow and its consequences. While that event is undeniably important, it is not the only aspect of his life recorded in Scripture. The Book of Judges presents him as a capable leader, a skilled negotiator, a defender of Israel, and a man who demonstrated considerable knowledge of his people's history. Hebrews appears to reflect that broader perspective. The author remembers him within the context of God's larger work in Israel, rather than reducing his entire legacy to a single controversial episode. This does not erase the difficult questions surrounding his story. Instead, it places them within a wider framework. One of the most profound lessons of Hebrews 11 is that faith and imperfection frequently coexist. The chapter does not celebrate human greatness as an end in itself. Rather, it celebrates God's faithfulness, working through ordinary people whose lives often contained significant weaknesses. The spotlight ultimately remains on God rather than on the individuals being described. Jephthah's presence in the chapter therefore tells us as much about the nature of faith as it does about the man himself. Faith, in the biblical sense, is not the absence of flaws. It is the willingness to trust God amid uncertainty. This perspective also explains why Hebrews never revisits the controversies associated with Jephthah's life. The author is not writing a commentary on Judges. He is constructing an argument about perseverance, trust, and endurance. For that purpose, Jephthah serves as one example among many showing how faith can operate within difficult and imperfect circumstances. His inclusion does not require approval of every decision he made. It requires recognition that genuine trust in God was present within his story. By the time readers encounter his name in Hebrews, centuries have passed since the events recorded in Judges, yet his legacy remains alive because it illustrates a truth running throughout the entire biblical narrative. God's work in history has often involved people whose lives resist simple categorization. Jephthah was neither a flawless hero nor a figure defined solely by failure. The New Testament remembers him because, despite the complexity of his story, faith remained one of its defining elements. When the biblical account of Jephthah finally concludes, the ending appears almost surprisingly brief. After the dramatic events that dominate Judges 11 and 12, the narrative simply states that he judged Israel for 6 years before his death and burial in Gilead. There is no lengthy farewell address, no royal succession, and no elaborate summary of accomplishments. Yet the brevity of the conclusion stands in sharp contrast to the lasting impact of his story. Few figures in the Book of Judges have generated as much discussion among historians, theologians, biblical scholars, and ordinary readers. Thousands of years later, Jephthah remains one of the most debated personalities in the Old Testament. Not because his story offers easy answers, but because it raises difficult questions that continue to resonate across generations. From a historical perspective, Jephthah occupies a fascinating position within Israel's early development. He emerges during a period when tribal identity remained stronger than national unity, when local leaders often carried more influence than centralized institutions, and when external threats constantly tested the stability of the Israelite communities. His rise demonstrates how leadership could emerge outside traditional structures during times of crisis. He was not a hereditary king. He did not inherit a formal office. He was elevated because circumstances demanded someone capable of addressing problems that existing leaders could not solve. In that sense, his story provides historians with a valuable glimpse into the realities of leadership during the era of the Judges. Authority was often practical before it became political. Communities followed individuals who could protect them, organize them, and guide them through moments of danger. Jephthah's life reflects that reality with unusual clarity. From a literary perspective, his narrative stands among the most sophisticated in the entire book. The story combines family conflict, social exclusion, political negotiation, military diplomacy, theological tension, personal tragedy, and tribal warfare into a single interconnected account. Unlike many ancient heroes whose stories move in a predictable direction, Jephthah's journey repeatedly defies expectations. He begins on the margins of society, yet becomes a national leader. He enters the narrative as a displaced figure, but eventually speaks with the authority of a statesman. He demonstrates historical knowledge that few readers anticipate. He secures a major military victory. Yet, at the very moment when triumph appears complete, the narrative introduces one of the most painful episodes in the Old Testament. This complexity is one reason the story continues to attract scholarly attention. It refuses simplistic interpretations. Every attempt to reduce Jephthah to a single label ultimately proves inadequate. Theologically, his legacy remains equally significant. The debates surrounding his vow continue because they touch upon larger questions that extend far beyond his own lifetime. What is the relationship between faith and wisdom? How should difficult biblical narratives be interpreted? What happens when sincere devotion becomes entangled with human misunderstanding? How should readers distinguish between actions described in Scripture and actions endorsed by Scripture? These questions have occupied Jewish and Christian interpreters for centuries, and Jephthah's story often serves as a case study in exploring them. The narrative's enduring power lies partly in its refusal to resolve every tension. Instead of offering neat conclusions, it invites readers into careful reflection. It demands thought rather than passive acceptance. This quality has allowed the story to remain relevant across vastly different historical periods and cultural settings. There is also a broader lesson about the Book of Judges itself. Jephthah's life illustrates both the strengths and weaknesses of the age in which he lived. The period produced courageous leaders capable of extraordinary achievements. It also revealed the consequences of social fragmentation, spiritual confusion, and unstable leadership structures. The conflict with Ammon exposed external dangers. The conflict with Ephraim exposed internal ones. Together, they reveal a society struggling to maintain cohesion in a rapidly changing world. Through Jephthah, readers gain insight not only into an individual, but also into the larger condition of Israel during one of the most turbulent chapters of its history. His story functions as a window into an age where leadership was necessary, but rarely sufficient to solve deeper problems. Military victories could secure borders. They could not automatically heal divisions within the nation itself. Another reason Jephthah's legacy endures is because it reflects realities that remain recognizable today. Questions of belonging, identity, legitimacy, leadership, and personal responsibility continue to shape human experience across cultures and generations. Readers may live in vastly different worlds from ancient Gilead, yet many still recognize elements of their own struggles within the narrative. The desire for acceptance, the consequences of difficult decisions, the burden of leadership, and the complexity of human motivation are not uniquely ancient concerns. They remain deeply human concerns. This universality helps explain why the story continues to attract attention long after the specific political circumstances that produced it have disappeared. In modern biblical scholarship, Jephthah is often discussed not because he fits neatly into established categories, but because he challenges them. He is neither a conventional hero nor a straightforward cautionary figure. He demonstrates remarkable strengths while simultaneously becoming associated with one of Scripture's most difficult tragedies. He shows political wisdom in one context and questionable judgment in another. He succeeds where others fail, yet his successes never remove the shadow cast by later events. Such complexity mirrors the way historians often encounter real people, rather than legendary figures. Human beings are rarely defined by a single moment or characteristic. Their lives consist of contradictions, tensions, strengths, and weaknesses that resist easy summary. In that respect, Jephthah may be one of the most realistic figures in the entire Book of Judges. Ultimately, the complete legacy of Jephthah is not found in a single battle, a single vow, or a single controversy. It emerges from the entire arc of his story. He remains important because his narrative captures the complexity of leadership in a fractured world, the challenges of faith amid uncertainty, and the consequences of decisions whose effects reach further than anyone expects. The Book of Judges preserves his story not because it offers a perfect example to imitate, nor because it presents a simple warning to avoid. It preserves the story because it reveals something profoundly true about the human condition. Great strengths and serious weaknesses can exist within the same person. Public success does not eliminate private sorrow. Historical significance does not guarantee personal clarity. And sometimes the most enduring stories are not those that provide easy answers, but those that continue forcing each new generation to wrestle with difficult questions long after the events themselves have passed.